The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from A Perfumed Scorpion by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Imitation Sufis. The main reason why the more visible so-called Sufi circuses exist is, in addition to public demand, the fact that most authentic Sufis actually avoid, as far as possible, display or talking about secrets or flamboyance. Neither are they concerned with the wearisome, semi-occultist didactic of so many writers on Sufism today. The teacher, as one major exponent of Sufism has said, is one who abandons ceremonial and religious display and social appearances and concentrates on real development. Since the Sufi uses all legitimate means to bring his experiences and teaching usefully to people who will be able to accept it in the most truly effective manner, he may be next to invisible to people expecting a high-profile presentation. The saying has it, what the self-imagined mystic seeks only in his meditation is visible to the Sufi on every street corner and in every alleyway. Add to this even the minor additional element of the traditional behaviour of Sufis, that some of them dress well and eat delicious food to annoy and deflect superficialists, those who judge shallowly by appearances, as equally authentic tradition has it, and you may understand why the Sufi is said to be more deeply hidden, in effect, than anything on earth. He wants to shake you off, if you judge by externals, and he has all the ways in the world of doing it. This, too, is why the continuity of real Sufi understanding today is just as operative as it ever was. Our own experience makes nonsense of the oft-repeated question from the always abundant limited thinkers who ask where the Sufi giants disappeared to, or why they are not produced today. This question is legitimate only if you accept the assumption that the Sufis must necessarily be towering personalities on the skyline, or oddities of any kind, and are what Sufism is supposed to be producing constantly, instead of people serving mankind, whether publicly or otherwise, whether labelled as Sufis or not. There is probably no stronger evidence of selective study or institutionalized thick-headedness than the fact that those who worship personalities and crave their reappearance should ignore what some of the greatest of them said on this subject. Do not look at my outward shape, but take what is in my hand. Rumi. And the requirement in a teacher is not that he should look important and do miracles. It is that he should have what the disciple needs. Ghazali. If you are in awe of him, you cannot learn, any more than if you discount him. The Sufi insistence is, in current language, upon the difference between the showman and the educator, the emotionalist and the achiever. The achiever here, of course, means the effective person, not necessarily the man of achievement in presently fashionable professions. That the Sufi can, in fact, continue to operate without beating the big drum is useful, of course, at times and places where repressive systems curtail freedom of thought or expression. And this is, indeed, still the position in some countries today. And open societies which demand their educational intake only through simplistic formulae are also repressive of progress in learning anything beyond their accepted aims. Secondly, when the culture is in a phase, also recurring, in which it welcomes and encourages what are, effectively, mainly entertainers and stimulators of emotion or linear intellect, whether linked notionally with religion or psychology or not, the Sufis' ordinarily undramatic, carefully articulated operation and procedures will attract correspondingly little interest. They will be carried out privately, and you will not locate it through the occultist grapevine. It is only recently that conditions in some countries have stabilized sufficiently for the Sufi to get a hearing for his ideas right across the board, from reasonable numbers of rational people not discouraged by his references to what have more often than not been unfashionable ideas. Quite a number of Western thinkers have, indeed, been observant and generous enough to state that much present-day interest in the Sufis is based on what one of them has called greed, not hunger, for knowledge. This, then, is something of the framework. In order to see how it can be related to contemporary questions, I propose to take a very short look at some of the historical, literary, cross-cultural, and other evolutions of the Sufi teaching. Then we will return to those parts of the Sufi interest in human psychology which can in fact be dealt with in a more sequential manner. History and the Sufis. Considerations of Sufism very often begin with the question, and its attempted answer, how did Sufism arise, and what is it rooted in? According to historical documents, it is attributed to three sources, which many Sufis themselves have stated are essentially different manifestations of the same extra-dimensional, cosmic and divine impulse. Here they are. 1. Sufism has been known under many names to all peoples from the beginning of human times. 2. It was, for instance, transmitted by the Prophet Muhammad to his disciple and son-in-law Ali and to others 1300 years ago as the inner component of all religion. 3. It also persisted side by side with the prophetic transmission, as, for instance, in the independent witness of the historical figure of Uwais al-Qarni, a contemporary of the Prophet who, however, never met him. 1,000 years ago, however, al-Hujwiri, in the first Persian treatise on the Sufis and their ideas, noted that, as something perennial and sublime, it had no history as other things have a history. What he intends by that statement is to emphasize that the history of the Sufis is irrelevant compared to their perennial existence and function. What seems to many to be the history of the Sufis is the half-understood debris of necessarily transient operations and activities. So the Sufi fact is not easily to be regarded as an outgrowth of a culture, though Muslim Sufis have always insisted that its insights are both compatible with Islam and also constitute the inner dimensions of that and all other intact religions. This assertion, many people note unexpectedly, has been widely accepted by members of several religions, by Jews, Hindus, and Christians who have delved deeply into Sufism. It is, of course, generally known that Sufi study and activity has mainly been developed and transmitted in the Islamic world, and that all major public Sufi teachers have been within the Islamic fold. There is, however, abundant evidence which shows that Sufis have recognized the existence of Sufis far beyond the conventional frame of Islam. The position, in a literary sense, is further complicated by the fact that they have sometimes, as with al-Ghazali, who died in 1111 AD, been regarded as the most authoritative exemplars of Islamic theology, and yet at other times, as with Ibn Arabi the Spaniard, who died in 1240 AD, as apostates and blasphemers. These conflicting opinions, of course, are nowadays seen to be reflections of observer bias much more than anything else. Evolutionary Religion. These biases have been resolved in retrospect by the understanding that all authentic expressions of human spiritual aspiration may be seen as having a single source, and that the differences are in appearances only, imposed by cultural and local conditions. Thus, for instance, major religions are viewed from this standpoint as parts of a continuum of perception of needs culminating in the last world religion, Islam, dating from the 7th century of the Christian reckoning system. Both Islamic ideology and Christian thinking, of course, would find no difficulty in the idea of the perenniality of religion, though few people seem able to keep this in their minds to any useful purpose. The Quran refers to believers in the Jewish dispensation, for instance, before Islam, as Muslims, and St. Augustine himself said that Christianity existed before the time of the historical Jesus. Literalists and perceptives. The psychological problem which arose between Sufis and literalist theologian Muslims in the Middle Ages was very similar to the one which is also encountered in Christianity, the assumed conflict between religious belief and mystical perception. If faith and adherence to the holy law were the highest religious good, how could contact with the infinite be needed, or even possible? If its purpose was to transcend the acceptedly complete spiritual dispensation of the faith, was such a concept not dangerous elitism? If the consequences of such a pursuit put one man or woman above another in religious terms, what about the equality of all believers? What about the Church's hierarchy? Since in past times people were often judged for religious merit and goodness only on their apparent conduct, surely, it was argued, those who believed in an allegedly more real knowledge of the divine, as distinct from legal, ritual, or social observance of an expression of it on earth, were setting up an alternative hierarchy of merit, and a partly invisible, largely uncheckable one at that. This matter was thrashed out in the Middle Ages by both the Christian and Islamic theologians. In Christendom, mysticism was more severely dealt with, on the whole, partly because of the more centralized power of the Church, and partly because the Bible, unlike the Quran, did not seem to most of the theologians of the time to support the possibility of mysticism for independent individuals, whose utterances were not verified by current dogma. The Sufis could be judged by an enormous amount of what has even been called virtually the origin of modern psychological research and publication. They pointed out, as we have noticed, that people's beliefs could be conditioned, and that they very often were. They insisted that hypocrisy could not be controlled by social legislation, however pious its source, and could only be transcended by self-realization. They invoked passages in the Quran which supported the reality of individual knowledge of the ultimate. To these contentions and to this contribution, they added very much more, and this forms a most voluminous bibliography. Even Western scholars have been widely fascinated by this phenomenon, publishing one work on an average of every 14 days on Sufism in the past 200 years alone in Western languages. The study of Sufi ideas, if not the deeper understanding of them, is thus of no new growth, even in the West. It took the Sufis, however, nearly 5 centuries before they completely won acceptance for their teachings within Islam. That was about 800 years ago. Versatility of Sufism. During all this time, Sufis were sometimes canonized and sometimes judicially murdered, sometimes jeered at for flippancy or for severity of behaviour. They have been described, too, by all the gradations in between these extremes, but throughout it, and subsequently, the repute of the Sufis was immensely reinforced by the production of literary classics in several major Eastern languages, and by the sustained emergence among them of astonishingly powerful, versatile, attractive, and talented people. These were among the outward manifestations of inward development, according to the Sufis themselves, and in the eyes of many outside observers as well. It was to this extra-dimensional perceptive source, too, that the enunciations of psychological insights, of facts of physics without what are today regarded as essential scientific apparatus, and other similar baffling affirmations of knowledge, to which I have referred, were ascribed. Parallel with these events came several others, Sufi thought was adopted, as scholars of the time, and modern ones as well, have more than adequately demonstrated, by people from virtually all the cultures of a major portion of the then known world. There is, indeed, no other system of mystical thought on record which has been able to attract and recruit devout and iconoclastic thinkers from the Jewish, Christian, and Hindu dispensations, effectively transcending the barriers of misunderstanding and ideological hostility, which have certainly been as great as any others known to humanity. Sufi ideas also penetrated the religious, secular, and scientific writings and studies of the Middle East and Central Asia, as well as those of Europe, to an unprecedented extent. Certain Sufi teachers had droves of followers from religions other than Islam, and this is all a matter of uncontested, though often somewhat baffled, record. At that time, of course, the present-day divisions of the academic disciplines and professions had not come about. Therefore, up to the late Middle Ages, the Sufis, from Malaysia and the confines of China to Turkestan and India, and from Turkey to Arabia, Africa and Spain, continued their research and teaching in what we would nowadays call very many specialized fields. They worked and published in religion, in literature and poetry, in astronomy and physics, in community phenomena, and in psychological studies, these impractical and otherworldly iconoclasts, as one historian, somewhat baffled and bafflingly, calls them. The approach to knowledge. The Sufi approach to knowledge differs, however, dramatically from that of the European Renaissance man, who excelled in all kinds of chosen interests. The Sufi's choice of worldly interests was, and is, held to be determined by his awareness of their value to the human race, in accordance with his perception of a cosmic design. His choice of study and activity is, to him, determined by Sufi understanding, not by arbitrary interest. Sufis do not cultivate interests and seek facts. They pursue successive layers of reality by understanding them. Experience without understanding is water without wetness. In modern, almost conversational terms, the Sufi will say, "Knowledge of absolute truth transforms man. It is also this which puts everything else into perspective." He can teach, if that is one of his functions, and many major historical Sufis would take no disciples, by virtue of the consciousness which enables him to know A. himself, B. the student, C. how the student can be taught. The mere desire to teach is regarded as a disability, rooted in ambition developing before understanding is mature. Desire to teach is disabling. One major Sufi says, "I had a desire to teach. I therefore ceased teaching until I became mature enough to do it properly, without the desire influencing my ability and therefore my duty to students. When the desire to teach left me, I started to teach." Vocation-minded scholars, sentimentalists, and others, of course, regard this quite tenable attitude with astonishment and even incredulity. So, of course, the Sufi's ability to assess his pupil by personal capacity enables him to construct the study course. If a Sufi is not a teacher, he exercises other functions in society, correspondingly determined, but that is an entirely different subject. Attunement. Since Sufi psychology involves the attunement of the Sufi with individual and collective humanity, and an equivalent attunement with an ultimate reality, it is a harmonization which can only come about after the practitioner is trained. Neither the practice nor the training, however, bears much resemblance to anything understood by those words in other fields which we ordinarily encounter. Sufism, therefore, is purposeful, and the purpose is, above all, understanding. In order to understand, one must enter a real Sufi study course, not just a familiarization with the externals, which are in any case likely to have been superseded. The Sufi must know himself before he can know others, in the sense and on the level on which Sufi psychology is held by him to function. In dealing with Western-type thinkers, as in introducing any culture to unfamiliar concepts, we have to make sure that the following are among the procedures which we have employed. There must be sufficient familiar content for the student to be able to build upon. This can be done with Sufi psychology by introducing the concepts, for instance, of flexibility, the inhibiting effect and self-indulgent consumerism of undue emotion, the frequent confusion of entertainment and study, so that the audience can think about these things. This is partly informational and partly designed to widen the horizon of the student's mind. One reason for the need for an ongoing relationship with students, of course, is that some of them will always seize upon one or more new principles and imagine them to be a golden key. The world is full of people who have done this and have set up schools riveted onto the principles that, say, too much emotion is bad, or that quantity is better than quality, or the reverse. The imitativeness and premature operation, the rush to put something into action, is not confined to cargo cults in New Guinea. So, anthropology, like charity, begins at home. You may have observed it abroad, where the cargo cult is conspicuous, but you can make a good deal of worthwhile use of it in any country, and above all in understanding neglected aspects of human thinking.
Copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.